Thank you for joining us today on A Certain Sound. We are in the book of Genesis, chapter 22, talking about worship, but as it is in the context of seeking God. God is seeking men who are seeking Him. One of the characteristics of a person who is seeking God is that they worship in spirit and truth. They're concerned about true worship. A lot of what's called worship in churches is not worship. It's not, okay? It's pleasing self and pleasing men and pleasing flesh. True worship, number one, Genesis 22. True worship involves giving God's word priority. Number two, true worship, okay, is when obedience is our activity. Let's go back. With Abraham, God said, "Give me back your son." Genesis 22:1. Abraham obeys, takes his son. He says to the men, "Tarry here while I and the lad go yonder and worship." The first time worship is mentioned is right here. Now listen to this. This is important. God's word in worship is a priority. Number two, obedience was Abraham's activity. Look at this. And he arose. You see that? Verse 3. And Abraham arose. He didn't argue with God. He just got up and did it. He got his son, he got the servants, he got the wood, he got the fire, and he did it. It's part of worship. Obedience is connected to it. I and the lad will go yonder and worship. But in order to worship, he had to obey. In order to worship, he had to obey God's word. He had to give God's word priority. Then he had to obey it as his activity. He rose up early. Obedience cannot be divorced from worship. King Saul will tell you that. What did King Saul do? Well, King Saul was supposed to kill Agag, okay, that wicked king, and all the animals. He wasn't supposed to spare anything. But he does. He spared the king and he spared the best of the sheep and the cattle. Samuel comes along and says, "Have you done the commandment of the Lord?" He said, "Oh, yep, obeyed God completely." He said, "How come I hear this bleating of the sheep? This noise from the sheep?" And Saul says, "Well," he says, "the people we saved all those animals, the best, just the best, so that we could worship God." "Oh, you're going to worship God." Right. What does Samuel say? He says, "You disobeyed." "Yeah, but we're doing something worshipful. We're going to worship." Samuel says this famous line, "To obey is better than sacrifice." In other words, what he's saying is you can sacrifice all day long and act like you're worshiping God going hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. But if you're not rightly related to God, if you're disobedient to God, your singing of those songs and your worshiping and that quote unquote worship is meaningless. It's meaningless. If we willingly or knowingly are not right with God, even if we don't know we're not right with God, we need to ask God to show us. Before we start worshiping, let's get God's word to be a priority because that'll tell us the truth about ourselves. And then obedience will be our activity. We must be obedient to Him. Worship isn't worship if we are knowingly or unknowingly not right with God. Samuel said it doesn't matter what you're doing by sacrificing. Obedience is better because that's what makes your worship.